Nowadays, very cheap, or in some cases completely free computing is really taken for granted. Let's say, for example, you want to go and spin up a server. You've got a couple of dollars laying around, and you go to one of the countless VPS companies, you say, I want that server, and there you go. You just have a server. Or maybe you want to do something a bit more locally. You've got some spare hardware laying around, and you go and chuck Linux on it, you install some server software, and there you go. You're basically done. And assume you have the hardware laying around, Linux is completely free. You don't have to pirate anything, there's no license, you just have it. But it has not always been this easy. For much of computing history, you'd probably buy some form of Unix license. Yes, there were plenty of other operating systems like OS2 as well, and they had their place as well, but my focus today is on the relationship between Unix and Linux. Now, you may not realize this, but Unix is still alive, at least in some sense today. There are things like HP UX, IBM AIX, Oracle Solaris, which are available right now today, still being sold, and still being updated. So yeah, there are still companies right now using Unix, and they probably have no plans to swap to anything else. The system still works, it is still being sold to them, so why would they leave it? But why then do a lot of people just not realize this is happening? And why did Linux take over an absolutely massive chunk of the Unix user base? Not only that, but basically controls this newfangled World Wide Web. Well, the first reason is very simple. Price. And I don't necessarily mean free. Yes, free is incredibly valuable to people that don't have that much money. Say a university, a college, a startup, some student, some basement dweller out there who just wants to run a server. For these people, yes, not having to pay any money, being able to set up a server without any challenge whatsoever, absolutely incredible, and without a doubt has had some level of influence. When we're talking about the corporate space, free may not be as much of a selling point. Say, for example, you have the option of going with a Unix system. It's from IBM, Oracle, HP, doesn't really matter, just pick a big company that you know about. This company is going to offer support. So if something goes wrong, you can contact them and they will, send someone out. They will help you to fix the system. And if something does go wrong and it's like irreversibly wrong, you know exactly who to hold accountable. Now we have the option of a community managed Linux distro. It's managed by a bunch of random people. You don't know these people. You don't know how to hold them accountable. Yeah, there is support in the form of IRC and wikis, but no one that you can just call up to just fix the system. Which one of these makes more sense as a company? In this case, it would be the Unix system. And if every project remained like a Debian, like a Slackware managed by the community, this is probably the decision a lot of companies would be making. But very early on in the life of Linux, Red Hat and SUSE formed. They are companies. They started offering a product, and that product wasn't free. But it was a lot cheaper than what some of the Unix providers were offering. But even so, they were offering support, they were offering documentation, all for a price. At that time, they weren't an Oracle, they weren't an IBM, but they were a company. So if something went wrong, you knew exactly who to call to go and yell at to fix the problem. Now, to be clear, I am not saying that no company whatsoever would want to go and use a community-run distro. That is not the case at all. There are absolutely massive companies out there where all of their systems run on Debian, all of their systems run on Alma Linux, all of their systems run on Rocky Linux, or other community-run and managed distros. But if you are a super serious suit-wearing businessman and you want to have a super serious distro that you know that you can trust, I can see the value of having some sort of company behind it. The other major benefit is the kinds of hardware supported. So it's fairly common with a Unix system for it to be, let's say, really locked down. This is IBM AIX. This is a proprietary Unix operating system designed to run on the IBM Power servers. These are not just some random servers you just get off the shelf. It's not just some regular hardware that you just put together. This is the IBM server that you buy from IBM. And this is not just an IBM thing. A lot of these Unix companies are not making generic systems. They are making the HP system, the Oracle system, and you are going to buy the hardware from this company. However, with Linux, this was originally made to run on the Intel 8386. Torvalds did this because that's what he had at the time, and he made Linux to learn how that hardware works. Now, Intel back then was nowhere near as big as they are today, but as the consumer space evolved, and as Intel grew and grew and grew, x86 and then x86-64 basically controls the consumer space. There are a couple of exceptions, but when we're talking about desktop systems, it's almost entirely x86-64, both on the Intel side and the AMD side. So you can just go buy some random grey box system, slap Linux on it, and you're pretty much good to go. Google famously did this in their very early days when they talked about scaling outwards rather than scaling upward, rather than having one really big server that is very expensive, and if it goes down, everything goes down. Instead, what you should do is have a bunch of these cheap systems where if one of them dies, it doesn't really matter. You can just replace it. It's a couple $100, and then you can have a lot more of those and scale absolutely massively. This is a big part of the reason why Google was able to scale as quickly as they did. Nowadays, this seems like a pretty sensible way to do things, but back then, that was revolutionary. But remember, that's just talking about the consumer desktop hardware. Nowadays, Linux runs on pretty much any architecture under the sun. So for pretty much any use case you have, if you need an operating system, Linux seems like a contender. Whether we're talking networking gear, IoT devices, arms in a factory that could pick up machinery and stuff, some car infotainment system, all of these systems can run Linux. And if your developers understand Linux, maybe it makes sense to use in this context. You may also say source code availability, and I'm sure for some companies, this was absolutely valuable, and definitely for the individual developers, and for developers who are trying to expand the system and offer their own Linux-based product. But when we are talking about just having access to the source code, there have always been licensing deals between some big Unix provider and some company that has an absolutely massive wallet. If they really need the source code, most of the time there is enough money they can pay to access it. But hey, free source code is also very nice as well. Now you might also be thinking, doesn't this kind of apply to BSD as well? Things like FreeBSD, OpenBSD, and NetBSD. I would argue kinda, yeah, it does. There's not really a massive company in the BSD space, at least massive to the scale of something like SUSE and Red Hat, but I think it simply comes down to timing. Whilst the Berkeley software distribution, the original BSD, massively predates Linux back in 1978, what we know today as modern BSD didn't happen until a little bit after Linux. FreeBSD and NetBSD started in 1993, and OpenBSD wasn't until 1997. Both Debian and Slackware already happened a few months before NetBSD even existed. The now beloved Red Hat was around the same time as well, and then 2 years later in 1995, they released Red Hat Commercial Linux. Now SUSE was actually a little bit earlier, in 1992, with SUSE Linux releasing in 1994. So maybe if FreeBSD and NetBSD were like 2 or 3 years earlier, maybe Red Hat would have been a BSD company. However, there was one BSD in place to possibly supplant Linux, that being 386BSD. As the name would suggest, it was made to run on the same CPU as Linux, the 8386, and it actually started development before Linux even started, back in 1989. Now, the problem is they flew a little bit close to the sun. In 1992 they released, and when they released, there was a lawsuit. Unix System Laboratories Inc. versus Berkeley Software Design Inc. So, the Computer Systems Research Group at Berkeley basically had a license to Unix source code, and the opposing party pretty much claimed that they were using some of that source code in their completed system, saying this breached USL's software license contract, infringed on USL's copyright on Unix, diluted USL's trademarks on Unix, and misappropriated USL's trade secrets on Unix. Now, the project ended up continuing till 2016. However, when you get a lawsuit literally at the start, a lot of that commercial interest that may have been there suddenly vanishes and goes and finds other things to focus on. Which was really bad timing because Linux was right there, and Linux absolutely exploded. Now, 386BSD didn't completely vanish, even though it stopped in 2016. NetBSD and FreeBSD directly spawned off of this project. But it wasn't until a year later when Debian and Slackware existed and the timing just completely fell apart. If they had maybe another year or another 2 years, I could see a world where BSD is what took over the Unix space. But let me know what you think. Do you think there was ever a chance that BSD could have taken over that space? Do you think it was just inevitable that Linux was going to? And do you know anyone who works on a Unix system? Maybe you know someone at a super serious suit-wearing company that still has to deal with one of these systems. I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really liked the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe to the Libera Pay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and I like Unix. I don't know.
Something like this.